Hi everyone. Today, I'll be talking about the very first rifle I owned and an interesting story about how I obtained it and the history about the rifle itself. Now, if you remember the very first rifle you purchased, Milsurp or otherwise, go ahead and mention in the comments. So, I remember it was August of 2020, and I had only been working a job for about a month and a half already, and money was burning a hole in my pocket. My military collection started to grow, and I wanted a rifle to add to the collection. Now, this isn't the very first firearm I purchased, mind you. That happened to be a Mossberg 12 gauge, but this is the first rifle and the first Milsurp rifle I purchased. Now, here's the part where the interesting story about how I obtained it starts. So, I visited a pawn shop I frequent quite often, and I remember looking for specifically having a mindset that I wanted a Milsurp rifle. Now, I didn't have a huge budget. Most people, when they start with Milsurp rifles, they either collect a Carcano or maybe an Enfield when they used to be cheap, or people who have the money for it, they'll buy something like an M1 Garand or a Mauser rifle, like a German Mauser rifle. But I saw this rifle sitting there on the shelf for $300, and the part that caught my eye, as opposed to any other Milsurp rifles that were there, is that on the buttstock there was a post-it note, and on the post-it note was written Mauser, ? 7mm ? That caught my attention. I love myself a good mystery. And what I could tell from my observation of it was a military rifle of some kind, obviously. It had a stacking rod, it has a bayonet lug, it's a full-length rifle, and I estimated it must be somewhere from the early 20th century. Now, the reason I couldn't immediately identify the rifle, and neither could the staff of this pawn shop, is... I'm not sure you can see it. I'll move the camera in a little bit, but there's no markings at all on this rifle, other than a 1903/14 that's barely visible right here on the receiver of the rifle. And other than that, there's not even any mentions of the caliber of the rifle, the manufacturer, or anything of that sort, a country of any kind. So I decided to take the gamble, and I purchased the rifle for about $300. And I went home, I did my research. Now, after I did my research, I figured out what it was. This is a Steyr-manufactured Greek Mannlicher-Schoenauer model of 1903-14. And after some further research, I've come to the conclusion that this may have been an Austrian issue during the First World War, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Now, this is quite a weird rifle for someone to start collecting with. Like I said, most people start off with Enfields, Carcanos, M1 Garands, but I started off with a Mannlicher-Schoenauer with, which by the way, only about 52,000 of these were manufactured. So that may sound like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not. So let me go ahead and talk about the history now. Here's the rifle in all of its glory. It's quite the looker, isn't it? It's also quite the feat of engineering. The rifle was developed by Ferdinand Mannlicher and his protege, Otto Schoenauer. Ferdinand Mannlicher was quite the prolific firearm designer of the late 19th century. Some of his inventions include the M-block clip, which rifles such as the Carcano use, and the Steyr M95, which was the primary firearm used by Austria-Hungary in the First World War and Austria during the Second World War. Ferdinand Mannlicher designed the bolt of this rifle, which more closely replicates the bolt of a Gewehr 88, while Otto Schoenauer designed the most unique part of this rifle, which is the internal magazine, which is a rotary magazine, which I'll show you in a few minutes. The Mannlicher-Schoenauer was first introduced at the World Fair of 1900 as the Model of 1900, which was the prototype version. Ferdinand Mannlicher and Otto Schoenauer were going to produce a rifle in accordance to its reception, meaning if many people at the World Fair preferred the rifle for its hunting and sporting capabilities, then it would be produced to that extent. However, if it was received quite favorably among nations and would, in turn be adopted as a military service rifle, the Mannlicher-Schoenauer would go on to become a service rifle for an army. However, due to its complicated nature and obscure cartridge, which, by the way, is this round nose 6.5 by 54 cartridge, not many nations adopted this rifle, except, most notably, Greece. Now, prior to 1900, Greece was using the Gra model of 1874, which was an antiquated black powder rifle. However, they wanted to rapidly modernize, as it was quite obvious that a storm was brewing in the Balkans, which, spoiler alert, that would eventually result in the outbreak of the First World War and many wars after that. So, by 1903, Greece adopted the rifle as the model of 1903, or Y1903 for the Greek prefix, and the rifle began to be produced primarily for Greek contracts. Eventually, in 1914, the Greeks eventually got an updated version of the rifle, which is this example right here. This is a 1903/14 model, which there weren't really any major improvements to the rifle, just little minor upgrades such as a new handguard and little details like that. I guess now would be a good time to show you the complicated nature of the magazine, which, like I said earlier, is the most unique part about the entire rifle itself. Because before I progress any further, it's going to add a lot more context as to why this rifle wasn't so readily adapted, and why countries, which I'll mention soon, adopted this rifle while others didn't. So, let's see if I can do this with one hand. Let me show you the magazine. So if I grab the rifle, and I was holding the rifle up with that Mosin clip right there, but anyway. So here's the magazine itself. Here's the bottom of the magazine. And it can be accessed by getting the cartridge like this, and with the nose of the bullet, I can kind of press it in to this hole right here. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. So I can press down and spin the... oh, I didn't do it. Let's try that again. Press down. I'll try and do this with one hand because I'm, filming with the other hand. There we go. So it can be accessed like this, which is honestly quite a great way to do this, considering that, this rifle is going to be handled by sometimes illiterate soldiers. So it's an easy takedown process. Anyway, I could just pull this out like this, and here is the magazine. It's a pretty neat looking thing, isn't it? So I'll put the rifle aside for now. So this is the rotary magazine I was mentioning earlier that Mannlicher-Schoenauer developed. Unlike other rifles, which usually is their magazine is usually operated by a spring, this rotates like this. So I can get the camera to focus. There we go. So the bullet, or the cartridge, would sit on it like this, and as the bolt is turned, it's going to rotate in the opposite direction. And the reason this concept exists is because it lends itself to a smoother feeding action. So it's a neat idea, but at the time, a very expensive and complicated idea in terms of manufacturing. So because of the high price tag, only the Greeks adopted it, and it was only the Greeks which were receiving the rifles prior to 1914, under contract, of course. Okay, so I did a jump cut because it's pretty hard to put the rifle back together with only one hand. But anyway, I digress. The Mannlicher-Schoenauer was, like I said, initially used by the Greeks prior to 1914, but something in 1914 would change all of that. Can you guess what it is? That's right, the outbreak of the First World War. Austro-Hungary found itself lacking the necessary equipment and weapons needed to wage full-on war against the Russians and any of their Balkan states that the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on in 1914. So, if you remember, the Mannlicher-Schoenauer was produced by Steyr, which was an Austrian factory or an Austrian company under contract for the Greek government, because the Greeks wanted the rifle to modernize its own army. So, in 1914, the Greeks were non-belligerent in the war. So, because of that, Austro-Hungary confiscated these rifles and issued them into service into the Austro-Hungarian army and, in some cases, Polish volunteer legions. I believe this rifle is one of the few 6,000 Mannlicher-Schoenauers which was issued into Austro-Hungarian service because, if you look here, you can faintly see 1903-14 is still on the receiver, but there's no crest, curiously. Why would a rifle, which was produced under contract for the Greeks, not have a Greek crest? Now, after some consultation with some other collectors and after some further research, I came to the conclusion that this rifle was one of the few which saw service under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Under the Austro-Hungarians, the rifle became known as the Repeatergewehr, and because of its, fast action, because of the rotary magazine. Now, at the conclusion of the First World War, and after the defeat and subsequent collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria gave many of these rifles back to Greece as war reparations, as Greece eventually joined the side of the victorious Allies. The Mannlicher-Schoenauer model of 1903 would go on to see combat against the Turks, against the Nazis in the Second World War, and eventually against the Greeks themselves, as the Greeks would fight a nasty civil war following the Second World War. So here's some nice little close-ups of the rifle. Here's the action. I'll cycle it for you. Super smooth. You see that? Beautiful. So, and here are the sights. And overall, the rifle is in pretty good condition. I've shot it. It's pretty good. I'll probably upload some footage at a later date whenever I have a chance to take it out shooting. But unfortunately, my example doesn't have the cleaning rod in place. There's the groove where it would have been. It doesn't seem that many surviving examples of the Mannlicher-Schoenauer have any cleaning rods. The only thing I can think of is that this rifle has seen, or these types of rifles have seen quite a considerable amount of service. As I mentioned, they fought in the Second World War, they fought the Turks, the Greeks used them in the Greek Civil War. And, at the end of the day, remember that I got this rifle from a pawn shop, and I won't reveal too much information about where I live, but I live deep in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. So, how this ended up on the Mexican border? No idea. So in conclusion, it's pretty cool that this is my first military rifle. It has such a really rich and obscure history, and that's what makes it so dear to my heart. Most people get a common hunting rifle, or they get a really popular military rifle as their first rifle, but the fact that I took a gamble on this and got something really, really cool means a lot to me. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the content regarding this rifle. I think it's really cool. And I hope you stick around for future videos, because hopefully I'll get better equipment soon. I know this one doesn't necessarily have the highest production value, but nonetheless, I hope you stick around, and I can't wait for you to see more content, which I'll be working hard on to produce in the future. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the video.